the Aeldari. If ever there were a case study in cosmic arrogance, it would be this elegant damned species. The Aeldari civilization was once the most advanced, powerful, and mystically sophisticated empire the galaxy had ever seen. But of course, as with most races in this dark galaxy, their tale is one of hubris, corruption, and eventual collapse. A self-inflicted tragedy of the highest order, one might say. Before mankind was even scrawling its first crude symbols in caves, the Aeldari were already ascendant. They had mastered the art of warp manipulation, created psychic technologies that baffled even the wisest of the Imperium, and were effectively immortal, providing they weren't stupid enough to get themselves killed, which, to be fair, they often were. Their star-spanning empire was ruled with a sophistication and refinement that would put even our most grandiose administratum protocols to shame. The Aeldari possessed incredible psychic abilities from birth, a fact that gave them an advantage over every other life form in the galaxy. Rather than grub around in the dirt for food and fuel, they bent the very fabric of reality to their whims, harnessing the energies of the warp through ancient sorceries and sophisticated devices. Their empire, as legend tells it, was one of shimmering cities and arcane wonders, realms of perpetual peace and prosperity. At least until they started turning their psychic gifts inwards, towards more personal indulgences. After all, why merely command reality when you could manipulate your own senses, thoughts, and desires? As centuries turned to millennia, the Aeldari became increasingly indulgent. Having conquered virtually every external challenge, they began looking inward. Their society, which had once been focused on innovation and expansion, fell prey to endless pleasures and obsessions. We humans would call it hedonism, but that hardly does it justice. The Aeldari invented forms of art and leisure so debased and twisted that it makes the most debauched imperial hive look like a monastery. Their cities turned into pleasure gardens, their sorceries repurposed to manifest the most twisted imaginings of their collective psyche. Of course, indulging in one's every whim and fantasy on a psychic level doesn't come without consequences, especially when one is as potent a psychic race as the Aeldari. Every unspeakable act, every whispered indulgence began to gather psychic resonance within the warp, like a pool of poison seeping into a stagnant pond. Over the centuries, their collective decadence reached a critical mass. They were too far gone, mind you, to notice or care. Most thought it was their divine right as Aeldari to reshape the universe to suit their whims. Even the pantheon of gods, save for a few beleaguered holdouts, turned a blind eye to this festering corruption. But the warp does not work like a poorly supervised playground. No, the psychic energy poured into it took form, coalescing into something vile, hungry, and insatiable. The Aeldari were busy feeding their every vice, and little did they know they were also feeding a burgeoning god. And then it happened. In a cosmic event known as the Fall, all that psychic decadence collapsed inward, like the most devastating implosion imaginable. Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess and pleasure, was born. Its psychic birth scream was felt across the galaxy, a wave of annihilation that vaporized billions of Aeldari souls in an instant and tore a gaping wound into the very fabric of real space itself, the Eye of Terror. Within moments, the heart of the Aeldari Empire was gone, ripped apart by the warp storm of their own making. Those Aeldari who had avoided the most severe moral decay, mainly partly because they had managed to escape to the outskirts of the Empire on the so-called craft worlds, were spared. Well, spared in the sense that they weren't immediately soul-devoured by Slaanesh. The rest, however, were not so fortunate. The Aeldari found themselves facing a new, unique problem. Every one of them was now a prime target for Slaanesh, who forever hungered for their souls. You see, for the Aeldari, death no longer meant slipping into the afterlife. It meant being devoured by a chaos god that was the embodiment of their own sins. Thus, the surviving Aeldari realized they had a monumental problem on their hands. Every Aeldari was now doomed to an eternity of torment if they died without protection. The craft worlds themselves, those great wraithbone-constructed megaships, had been built before the fall by the few Aeldari who, in a rare burst of foresight, saw that things were going terribly wrong. These craft worlds had withdrawn from the heart of Aeldari society, claiming they sought purity or some other vague virtue. Whether they genuinely saw the disaster coming or just disapprove of the noise and excess, who can say? With the Empire in ruin, the craft worlds became sanctuaries, drifting through the galaxy like floating mausoleums for the dead and the damned. Each craft world was an ark, carrying the last remnants of a once great civilization, desperately fleeing the reach of Slaanesh. The Aeldari aboard these craft worlds adopted the path system to protect themselves from falling to the same temptations as their ancestors. And through these paths, each a disciplined pursuit of one role, art, or martial skill, the Aeldari focused their psyches, restraining the excesses that had destroyed their race. They are organized into paths of the warrior, the seer, the artisan, and so on. But even the paths are a prison, a controlled environment to prevent them from spiraling into excess. These craftworld Aeldari are, in essence, haunted relics, living lives of rigid austerity as they drift among the stars, trying to atone for a past they are forever bound to repeat in spirit, if not in form. While the craft worlds embraced restraint and austerity, not all Aeldari survivors were so inclined. The Drukhari, or Dark Eldar, are the Aeldari who not only continue their ancestors' indulgent ways, but escalated them to heights or depths previously unimaginable. These dark cousins reside in Komora, a city within the webway, beyond the reach of Slaanesh's hungry gaze. Mostly. Komora is a city of eternal darkness and debauchery, where Drukhari torment each other and any unfortunate captive they capture, feeding off the pain and suffering of others to keep their own souls from decay. The Drukhari feed on suffering, prolonging their own lives through a twisted form of vampiric cruelty. They do not seek redemption or survival. They live only to indulge every dark desire and avoid the fate of their craftworld kin through sheer sadism. And so Komora festers on, an unholy monument to Aeldari's lowest, most depraved impulses. Those on the craft worlds, known as the Azuriani, are at best on borrowed time. Each of them wears a spirit stone, a device to capture their soul upon death, preventing it from being consumed by Slaanesh. These spirit stones are stored in the infinity circuits within each craft world, a ghostly repository of the souls of the dead, where they remain in restless semi-existence, whispering their collective memories to the living. Aeldari Farseers, warlocks, and other psychically gifted individuals are constantly scrying and seeking ways to avoid or delay their doom. They are masters of foresight, yet trapped in a web of paradoxes. They see thousands of possible futures, yet nearly all of them end in catastrophe. The Aeldari know that their species is dying. They are a shadow of a once great race, living as ghosts in hollow worlds of their own making. Some Aeldari look to the god Inyad, a nascent deity of the dead, believing that this new god, formed from the souls in their infinity circuits, might one day rise to save them from Slaanesh. The Inari, as these hopeful Aeldari are called, follow a path that promises a reunion with their lost kin in death, not an eternity of soul devouring. But, as with all things Aeldari, the road is fraught with treachery, and the outcome is uncertain. Summa summarum, the Aeldari are the tragic poets of the galaxy. Refined, powerful, and horrifically damned. The craft worlds drift in isolation like mausoleums of a lost age, each one a floating reminder of an empire's fall, a civilization left with nothing but the memory of its own self-inflicted doom. They wear the psychic mastery like a crown of thorns, bound to a life of rigid paths and relentless war, forever pursued by the shadow of Slaanesh. One might pity them, but it is hard to pity those who authored their own destruction with such relentless abandon. So, let the Aeldari drift in their ghostly ships, whispering songs of their former glory as they fade into oblivion. The galaxy, in all of its cruel irony, will ensure their once noble race becomes little more than a footnote in someone else's history.